So I'm excited to be here this morning. This is actually one of my favorite things that I do. So I'm superintendent of schools, Dr. Tucker, and my story is a little bit different. I don't know how much your teachers have shared already, but when I was born in Missouri. I was born in Springfield, Missouri, not too far from here, when my parents were going through training to become missionaries. And so then, by the time I was about a year old, we moved from the United States to France, where my parents and my brother, I was just a baby, they were learning French. And so we stayed there for a year, and then we moved to a country called Upper Volta. So this is your first test for the morning. I want you to try to find Upper Volta on this map that I put up here on the screen. Take a hard look and tell me, raise your hand if you can find Upper Volta. If you see Upper Volta, raise your hand when you find it. I'll give you maybe a minute. Anybody see it? You see it? Where's it at? You guys are brilliant. How did you know that? I'm done. I may as well just sit down. You are the only student that I have ever heard in like 18 years of talking about Africa that actually knew that they changed the name of Upper Volta to Burkina Faso. I was trying to trick you guys, and she figured it out. I need a high five.
Macy, tell Dr.
Awesome.
Tucker where Dad just got back from on a mission trip.
My dad, he flew over Burkina Faso to go to Ghana.
Oh, okay,
And
you got some insider trading.
And he actually was on Lake Volta helping.
I need to meet your dad. I know your mom, but I need to connect with your dad about his experiences. So let's take a look. I'm going to ask a different question. How many of you know where Burkina Faso is? Raise your hand. Everybody should know that, right? Because I heard you guys actually studied about my hometown and where I grew up in Burkina Faso. The capital city was Ouagadougou. Everybody say Ouagadougou.
Ouagadougou.
Did your teachers pronounce that correctly when they told you
We
the
didn't.
capital of
We
Burkina
didn't.
Faso? Okay. Well, they got close, so we'll give them credit for that. So let me tell you a little bit about my experience growing up in Africa. We moved from France to this country right here, which was Upper Volta, when I first settled there in like 1976. I'm kind of old. But then it changed overnight one night. It changed from Upper Volta to Burkina Faso. And so we lived in Upper Volta for a little while, but then we finished it out in Burkina Faso. In West Africa, I also lived in a country called Togo, which is right here next to Ghana, where your dad got to go. And then I visited a lot of different countries in and around West Africa as I was growing up. So today what I want to tell you is a little bit about culture, a little bit about communities in Africa, and I saw this map over here that is pretty phenomenal, but there's one little section that I think you guys are wrapping up, and that's right here where I grew up in West Africa, okay? A couple things about Africa. There's lots of countries in Africa, right? There's lots of different types of people. They speak different languages. They do all sorts of different things. But then there's also different types of climates, different types of regions. And so maybe some of the things that I share this morning will kind of ring a bell with you as far as the things that you've heard from your teachers, okay? So let's dive right in. The first thing I wanted to talk to you a little bit about was nomadic. What does it mean to be nomadic? If you're nomadic, what's that mean? Anybody know what that word is? What does nomadic mean? I'm going to write it up over here. Nomadic. You can also break it down to its root word, which is nomad. If I am a nomad, what that means is that I travel from place to place to place to place to place. And I may not stay in one particular area for but maybe a couple months, maybe 6 months at the most, but then I don't really have a set place where I live, but instead I move around. So what that means is that I am nomadic. Got that? So when you study history, you may learn about people that travel from place to place to place because they follow growing seasons. So maybe they're in one region of the United States for a little while because they're growing fruit. Maybe they move to another region for a little while because let's say they're growing corn or they're cultivating corn. Well, in Africa, it's actually pretty similar. Nomadic tribes oftentimes will go from place to place to place. They may live in a hut, they may live in a tent, but basically they follow livestock. Sometimes they follow water, sometimes they follow the rains as far as the rainy seasons, because a lot of times it's so hot and it's so dry that water gets soaked up pretty quickly because of the climate, because of the atmosphere. So this is an example of a nomadic family. And so you can see a couple things. They live in a tent. You've got mom and you've got a couple of kids here. You've got an oldest son. I don't see a dad in the picture. But instead, what I see, some observations are, these bags right here are probably things that they got from a market, right? And so if you've ever been to a farmer's market, it's kind of like that. It's open air. There's not in a building usually. But you go to a market, you can buy some grains, you can buy some dried fruit, some dried vegetables. You know, maybe they have some cooking oil right here, some rice. You can see some rice and beans. What do you think is in these jugs right here? Water. You guys know all about that, right? And the value of water and that resource in other parts of the world as compared to the United States. And so oftentimes what they would have to do is they would have to take these big jugs like what you see over here, or maybe some buckets, maybe some pails, different things like that. They may have to travel miles and miles and miles in order to find a water source. So maybe it's a creek, maybe it's a river, maybe it's Lake Volta, where they go and then they just scoop up the water and they travel back to their houses, or they travel back to their tents if they're nomadic. Sometimes if they're nomadic, maybe they settle close to a water source until that's all dried up or they decide to move on. But then they come back and they rely on that water. You think it's always the cleanest water whenever you dip it out of a creek or out of a river or out of a lake? Probably not. You put that water under a microscope and you look at all the different organisms and bacteria and things like that that live inside of it. It can be pretty nasty compared to some of the water that we have here in the United States as we filter it and we drink clean water, right? So a couple of other things. Take a look at this family. This is actually another kind of a herding family. And this is actually on the other side of East Africa. You may have seen some of these folks. These are the Masai tribe. And the Masai tribe are known for colorful clothes, colorful blankets, and things like that. They make a living off of cattle, right? It kind of looks that way. But then look at what they have as they herd their cattle. They don't take a whole lot with them. Maybe they have some bread. Maybe they have some fruit. You can see like a tea or a coffee drink. You know, maybe this is some type of juice. But another thing that they often use is cow's blood. And so one thing that they would do is they might take one of these cows. They don't look very healthy, do they? So they need a water source and they need vegetation for sure. But they may take one of these cattle and they may actually pull it over to the side, and one of the herdsmen would actually hold it and kind of bend its neck like this. And there's a jugular vein that goes right here. Humans have it, animals have it as well. But what they would do is they might take a bow and arrow or a spear or a sharp knife and kind of stick into that vein and allow some of that blood to kind of pour out into one of those containers. And it's kind of a container like this. I've got a picture of it actually. This is a Masai family. And the way that you can tell that they are a Masai family is because of the red coloring. I got this actually from Kenya over here on this side of Africa. But see this jug right here? This lady's carrying a jug. And it's got a lid on it, it's got a little handle on it. But what they would do is they would take that jug and they would put it up against the cow's neck and they would allow it to fill up. And whenever it's done, they would put the cap on it. And then they might take like some mud and get a little bit of water or maybe some dirt and some spit. And then they would get that mug and they would put it right here. They'd take that mud and put it on the jugular vein of the cow. What do you think that's going to do? It's going to heal it up and cause it to stop bleeding, right? It's going to stop the bleeding. What do you think they do with that blood when they're done? How might they use it? What's one way? They might drink it. That sounds kind of weird, right? What else? They're not vampires, right? What else might they do? Yeah. They might make, that's awesome actually, they might make red coloring for their hair or maybe makeup because the Maasai are known for being strong warriors. You can see their shields here, you can see their spears and everything like that. But they might end up using it in a lot of different ways. What's one other way back here?
They might take a part of their skin out and put the blood in their skin and then patch it out with some mud.
I've never heard of them doing that, but one thing that I've actually heard of them doing is taking the blood and mixing it with kind of like, it's called millet, but it's kind of like oatmeal and kind of mixing it that way, or mixing it with milk and actually drinking it. So it gives them some sense of protein. So these guys may not have to take a lot with them because they've taken some of their provisions, but because they have their cattle with them as well. In some cultures, guess what? The most valuable thing is their cattle. or their sheep, their livestock. And so some people would say that this particular group right here is probably pretty wealthy because they have so many cattle that are with them. Okay? So that's another example of life in Africa. And so take a look at, as we talk about water, when I lived in Upper Volta, Burkina Faso, we actually lived on the edge of the Sahara Desert. Have you guys studied about the Sahara Desert?
Yeah.
Is there a lot of water in the Sahara Desert?
No.
Probably not, right? And so we lived right about here on this map, which the Sahara Desert runs all the way across, right? And so you've got a pretty large desert in terms of that part. There's another desert down south here, which is called the Namib Desert. But we lived right on the edge of the Sahara Desert, and we lived in a mud house, which meant I could take a spoon and I could go to my bedroom wall, and guess what I could do? I could actually dig a hole out, or I could create a window into my brother's room if I really wanted to. But that's what we did. That's how we lived. Our front yard was sand, kind of like going to the beach, if you've ever been to a beach. And so we would kind of live that way. We had sandstorms. It was crazy hot during the day. Sometimes it would get as hot as 120 degrees, which is pretty hot. We don't get that hot here in Missouri. But you know how it feels humid sometimes in Missouri? In the Sahara Desert, there's no humidity. So under the shade, it wasn't too bad, or inside the house, it wasn't too bad. But when we lived in that mud house, one of the things that we had to do is basically what you see in these pictures right here. We had a water tower that was right next to our house. We had a lake that was close by, and guess what? We had a donkey cart. And our donkey cart, kind of like this one right here that had barrels on it, about once every couple of weeks, would go down to the local lake. There was a pump that was a hand pump that you could put the hose into the actual lake, and you could start pumping by hand and filling these barrels full of water. Once they were full of water, they would come to our house in our water tower. They would kind of attach the hose to an actual connection in the water tower that had some pipes that went up to the actual base of it, the basin of it. And then we would take another hand pump, and my brother and I would take turns. And sure enough, we would pump all of the water that was in these drums all the way to the very top of our water tower. Okay? So then when you went into the house, you could go to a faucet, you could go to a toilet, you could turn it on, or you could flush the toilet, or you could turn on the shower, and guess what would happen? Gravity would take the water from the water tower that was way up above our house and actually create running water inside of our mud house. There were hardly any other families that had that, because remember, the majority of those families were going to the lake, filling up their buckets, putting them on their heads, and carrying them to their houses, to their homes, to their huts. Okay? When we moved into our mud house, we actually had to put in all of the plumbing. So my dad, my brother, and I, we put in all the pipes, we put in all the toilets, we put in the shower, we put in everything. But before we had that, and before we had the water tower, guess what we got to do? We had an outhouse. That's pretty cool when you're a kid. It stinks, but it was pretty cool. And then we also showered outside in a bucket. I did that for about a year. And we also lived in a military tent, this big green tent. And so we lived like that for a little while until our house was ready. A lot of people didn't have this as far as their options. So they were going to the lakes, they were going to the rivers, they were going to the creeks in order to get the water that they needed. Here's another example, and this is in West Africa, close to where I lived. And take a look at this family. They live in a mud house. This is actually very similar to what I lived in, except we had a tin roof. But they lived in a mud house, and what this looks like, if you were to peel the mud away, you have mud bricks that are stacked up on each other. And then on the top, where you see their roof, it's kind of like this. It's kind of like a patchwork of wood, of beams, where that patchwork is all the way across. They lay down some mats, and then they come in and they put mud on top of that. Now, there are rainy seasons in Africa, aren't there? Are there rainy seasons on the edge of the Sahara Desert? Actually, there are. They don't last very long, but there are some rainy seasons. So what do you think happens when you take mud brick walls and you combine a thunderstorm? What's probably going to happen to your, yes, I saw you motion it. What were you doing?
It was going to melt down.
It's probably going to crumble down over time. And so see how these edges right here, some of these edges aren't real square, like what you would find here at this corner right here, or in a brick house. Over time, some of these have weathered. And so we actually had to do something in order to waterproof our walls. This is kind of gross, so hang on. What we would do is we would go out and we would collect all of this cow poop. Okay? And we would have the biggest pile of cow poop that you've probably ever seen in your life. And then we would take some water, and we would take some straw, and we would mix it all up, and we would get it nice and stinky and wet and everything like that. And then we would go up to our mud walls like this, and guess what we would do? We would put that stuff all over our mud wall. Because as soon as it hardens, as soon as it dries, guess what it does to that mud wall? It doesn't smell anymore, but what does it do? It totally waterproofs it. So the rains could come, the thunderstorms could come, and you wouldn't end up with walls that are starting to kind of deteriorate like these, but instead they would be intact. So your house wouldn't fall down. So looking at this family, they've been in this house for a little while. Do you see any electricity as you kind of look over here into the, the door area or the windows? They don't have electricity. You've got a little bit of a fire kind of ignited over here. You've got a mom and her child over here cooking, but look at how many people live under this roof. Take a look at the entire family here. You see these canisters right there? Those are probably canisters that they use to go gather water. Maybe they use some of these buckets to go gather water as well. But you can see everything that they own on their rooftop. And so look at this family way back here. They're sleeping on their rooftop because guess what? At night, it's actually cooler in the evenings. And so they may go out to their rooftop and sleep. During the daytime, where do you think it's going to be the coolest? Inside their house. Because their mud brick house actually kind of works like a cave because it's actually a lot cooler inside those houses than it is outside in the heat of Africa. Okay? Their transportation, all they have is a bicycle. And so they may take the bicycle to and from the market, to and from work. They may walk a lot. You can see how the roads are very narrow because there aren't cars coming through this part of Africa in this particular village. Because this is a pretty remote part of Africa. The other thing in their kitchens they'll cook outside. Like we talked about earlier, they'll use a lot of vegetables, they'll use rice. Sometimes if they're lucky and they have cattle or they have goats or they have chickens, that's how they'll get some of their protein. Where I lived in Africa, we ate a lot of okra. They loved okra. So you know how here in the United States, like one of our main meals is hamburgers or pizzas. They had this okra sauce that they would always eat. And when they sit around the table, it's not like here in the United States. They don't sit around the table and it's all nice and set with forks and knives and spoons and everything like that. In some of these more remote villages, they sit around a campfire or they sit around a circle. They have a big bowl of rice or kind of this sorghum or potato mush in a big bowl around them, and everyone eats with their hands. Everyone eats with their hands. So they hardly have utensils or anything like that. You can see some of the utensils that they have out right here that they cook with. But again, life in Africa looks a little bit different. Let's count how many family members we have here. So we have 1, 2,
3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11.
There's 11 under this house. There may be 1 or 2 back here in the shadows. 11 people under this one rooftop. Does anybody have 11 people in their family that live in the same house? So get this. You know how most houses here in the United States, most people in the United States live with mom, dad, maybe brothers or sisters, right? In Africa, in parts of Africa, you may have your aunts, your uncles, your grandma, your grandpa, and other people, maybe some cousins living with you under one roof. Why do you think they would do that? Right here. Okay? What do you think?
They don't have to make 2 houses.
They save money, so they live under one roof by not having to make 2 houses. That's a great observation. What else? So that they can be together. That's always fun when family's around. One more thing. What do you think?
Life is going to be a little bit more easy because there's more people.
Life's definitely going to be crazy because there's more people. But think about their jobs. If they're farmers, they have more people to help work the fields, right? And so they're going to be able to do more with more people living under one household. So maybe it's to save money, maybe it's to help with farms, maybe it's to help with chores. But you can see how families look a little bit different in this part of Africa. This is another example. They're out on their rooftop. You can see they've got their wood for their fires. They've got a lot of their provisions or a lot of their possessions that they have out here. A lot of times, rather than sleeping on a bed or a mattress like you would have here in the United States, maybe they'll just sleep on a mat. But you can see their food that they use as far as what they got at the market, some fresh vegetables or fruit, some dried fruit as well. You may have some flour, different things like that as far as oil. But take a look at this family. Let's count them. 1,
2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15.
That's bigger than the last one, wasn't it? Okay. These buildings are made out of mud as far as their houses. Take a look at this one. See how this one is more smooth? What do you think they put on the side of it? Well, they may have done that, but this one looks like it's actually had some concrete put on the side of it, some cement to kind of smooth it out. And the cement's going to actually be even more durable than the mud walls like you see here, but then also a little bit more durable than even that cow manure mixture that we talked about earlier. Okay? They've put some windows on it. They've got a door out here on the side. But again, these are the examples that you would see in West Africa as far as how people would live there. So switch a little bit with me to culture. And so culture of Africa, a lot of things that you might see come out of Africa, and you may have studied this, would be things like artwork. You guys all have art class? Okay. So as far as your art teacher being able to compare American artwork to African artwork. So up here on the left-hand side, and then this one, and then this one right here, they're going to create scenes of African life and African culture. It's called abstract a lot of times when it looks like this. And so maybe you've got a Masai family who's traveling through the bush or traveling through the area on a trail. You've got the warriors, you've got the wives and the children. You see the children on their backs. They carry them on their backs like that oftentimes. They've got their spears that they're carrying. And a lot of times this will be on cloth, similar to these here. These are called batiks. And the best way that I can think of to explain what a batik is, has anybody ever seen a tie-dyed shirt? I'm looking for a tie-dyed shirt. I don't see a tie-dyed shirt here this morning. Okay, you can put your hands down. That's kind of a, yeah, there you go. That's a tie-dyed shirt. What they will do is, like, let's say you took a white t-shirt and you scrunched it up and you put some rubber bands around it. And then let's say you got some water guns and you put some different colored dyes inside those water guns. So just water and food coloring. You mix it together, and then you shoot that t-shirt with all sorts of different colors. And then you take the rubber bands off and you hold out your t-shirt, and it looks pretty cool. It's tie-dyed, right? So maybe it looks like a rainbow, or maybe it's got different shapes and images on it. See the front of this? This looks pretty good, and it's a family. It's an example of the Masai tribe in East Africa. But when you flip it over, it looks a little different, okay? And what they'll do is they'll take different things like beeswax, and they will make the pictures that they want to make. And so see the back of this? So this one doesn't look very clean, or doesn't look very crisp, and it's kind of hard to see what it is. They'll take beeswax, and they'll make the image that they want to make out of beeswax. And then they'll put some dyes to it. And whenever they take the beeswax off, what they end up with is a pretty cool image. And so this one of an African drummer in a village, this one I got from West Africa. But these are examples of their artwork that they may have. This one's actually a painting of a village scene. You can see the huts. You can see this lady. What is she doing? She had gone and collected water, right? So she had collected water and poured it out into a bucket, and then poured it out into a larger a barrel, really, that they're going to use in their village. In some instances, if villages are lucky, they may have someone come in and actually dig a well or put in a pump. And so a lot of times when you're traveling in not so modern parts of Africa, particularly in West Africa, when you're outside of the capital cities, you may go into a village and you might see a pump in the middle of town. You guys ever seen what a water pump looks like?
Yeah.
Here in the United States, a lot of the old-time water pumps, like maybe you saw from Laura Ingalls Wilder, were those red pumps where you kind of crank them with your hand and then the water comes out into a trough. Well, in parts of Africa, they didn't have that, but instead they would have this big metal pump, and that people would line up with their buckets and take turns to be able to do that. So I've seen villages that didn't have a well, that someone came in and drilled a well down several hundred feet, tapped into water, and as soon as they tapped into the water, all the villagers were around, and that water starts coming up and it starts gushing out like it's raining, and guess what those villagers are doing? They are celebrating and going crazy because they have water right there in their village from a well that was below the ground. It's a pretty exciting time to be able to celebrate that, because guess what they don't have to do any longer? They don't have to put those buckets on their heads, go to the creeks, the rivers, or the lakes. load up with water, and come all the way back to their local villages in order to have their water source or have their water supply. What do you think? Is water cleaner from a lake or a river or a creek, or do you think it's cleaner from a well? Well. It's probably cleaner from a well, right? Is it 100% clean? No. Probably not, but it's better than what they've had to do over the years by having to go to a river, a lake, or a creek in order to get their water. Okay? A couple of other things as far as arts and culture. Let me back up to one. This down here to the far left, I don't know if you can tell what this is, but these are different beads and things like that. They've actually got a couple of masks that I'll show you real quickly. These are from West Africa. This one's from West Africa, and this one is actually from East Africa, which you could probably tell that because it looks red, and it's kind of that Masai mask that we've talked about a little bit. This one's from Burkina Faso, where I grew up. And so at our house, we have these displayed. We have a lot of African stuff in our home. But these are some traditional masks that tourists can buy now, but back years and years and years ago, and they still do this some in the tribes, they would actually wear these masks. And masks would represent different things. So for example, I'll give this one away. This one is what's referred to as a fertility mask. And so if you're a family that wants to have kids, they would have this mask in their home, or they may have a doll that looks very similar to this because they believe that this would help their family actually have children. Okay? Other masks they use for dances that have different meanings, whether it's for the growing season or whether it's for rainy season, whatever the case may be. All of these masks have different meanings. And a lot of times they would represent people like these do, or a lot of times they might represent powerful animals, whether it was a lion or a tiger, or not a tiger, but a leopard or an antelope or an elephant. So a lot of times these masks would have different meanings within African cultures. So switching over to another piece of culture, your music teacher would probably appreciate this. You can see up here on the left where you've got these tribal dancers that are dressed up in their garments. They have hats on. Oftentimes they would wear masks if they were drumming, but they'll play drums, they'll play maracas. This is kind of like a xylophone or a marimba if you've seen those before. It's made out of wood, and underneath there are these little kind of gourds, which when you hit every single one, it has a little different sound like a xylophone. You've seen those before. The various dances, you can see the African drums that they have here. This is actually one of the first guitars, which is made out of a gourd right here, which is a dried melon that they've hollowed out. They've put a stick on it, and then you can't see the wires, but they put some wire or maybe some twine that they pulled from one end all the way to the other. So it's kind of like an original African guitar. But then even in parts of Africa to today, they have bands just like what you might hear in the United States. Different bands. There's one that's called Ladysmith Black Mambazo, which is probably the most famous African band from South Africa. They're pretty amazing, but they actually play with a lot of different artists here in the United States. What I've got over here is a sample of a drum from Africa that I actually bought in Burkina Faso when I was there. And real quickly to tell you a little bit about how they will make their drums, they'll go in and they'll get a piece of wood, usually from a fallen tree, and they'll hollow it out. You guys see the inside of it? See how it's hollow? Everybody see that? This is a small version. You can see how big some of them get, right? You guys see the inside of it? Okay, so they'll hollow it out like an hourglass, and then they will go and they'll find an animal. Usually it's a goat. And they'll take a goat and they'll kill it and they'll eat the meat, but then they'll use the skin. And what they'll do with the skin is they'll clean off all the fat, and then they will go out and they will let it dry in the sun. Once it's dried in the sun, they will come in and they will kind of scrape it and make it soft so that it's kind of leathery. They'll shave off the majority of the fur. They've left some fur on here. They'll shave off the majority of it, and then they'll stretch it over this hourglass piece of wood. Once they've done that, they'll take some clamps, like these metal rings. There's a couple of metal rings. There's one here, like you can see, and then there are a couple right up here at the very top. They'll put one underneath the skin, and then one on top, and then they'll clamp it down with some cords, some string, or some leather, so that it's really, really tight. So here's what it sounds like. So the sound of the drum can actually change a little bit And the way that you can do that is you can take a campfire, or you can take like a stick with some fire on it, and you can actually hold it close to the skin. And what do you think happens to the skin? You don't want to burn it. What will happen to it? It'll stretch and it'll tighten and it'll make that sound a little bit different. So this sounds a little flat right now because we've not heated it up and stretched it. But they'll have drums that are this small all the way to drums that are larger like this. So they've got a lot of different variations of that in different parts of Africa. But that's pretty cool. When I was a kid, I was about your age, a little bit younger, I played a drum that was actually a box drum. I don't see a box drum up here. But some of you guys have seen box drums. You can buy them in the United States now. They're kind of wood, and you just sit on them and play them in between your legs or your knees. The ones in Africa were just like this, but they were a square piece of wood, and it had a piece of goat skin or a leather stretched over it as well. Okay? So some examples of culture as far as art and music. A couple of other things that I wanted to share real quick. This is a statue of a drummer. And he's actually playing a different type of drum. But it's a gourd, and then it's got a piece of leather that's stretched out over it, and it kind of hangs down in front of you, and you play it in front of you like this as you walk along or as you stand. I don't see one of those up here either. But this statue was actually made out of bronze. Okay? Remember talking about beeswax earlier? So they would take beeswax, and someone would make a statue like this out of beeswax. So they would be working with beeswax, and beeswax is kind of like candle wax, where you can kind of manipulate it and make an object or make a statue. So they would make a statue similar to this, and then they would take maybe some mud and put that mud all the way around it, so that it's all covered up. And they would put a little hole in the very top, and then what they'll end up doing is they'll end up taking all different types of metal, all different types of tin and copper or whatever they can find, and pour that, heat it up, melt it, and then they'll take it and they'll pour it into the top hole of that mud mixture that's covering up that wax statue. What do you think happens when that hot metal hits that beeswax? It warms it up. It actually melts it. And guess what happens? The metal mixture goes to the bottom, and then all that beeswax melts and comes out the top. And so once all that beeswax is out, they'll let it cool, and then they'll take, maybe a little chisel or a little hammer, and they'll hammer that dried mud away, and guess what they're left with? They're left with a bronze statue that's made out of different types of metal. And so if we wanted to, you can kind of see the corners of this later on when you're looking at some of this stuff. We could take some polish, maybe some toothpaste and a toothbrush, and we could work on this. And see how his elbow right here is really polished? It almost looks gold colored. It's bronze. We could polish this up and make it really bright, but I kind of like it this way. But this is another example of art and culture kind of combining into some of the things that they did. So a couple of other things here real quickly. As you take a look at athletics or sports in Africa, soccer is a big thing. And so you can see from kids playing without shoes, this kid's wearing an American flag, that's kind of cool. These guys aren't playing with shoes. All the way to a few years back ago when they held the World Cup in Africa, they have organized teams like what we have here as far as the park board. They have some other examples of sports in Africa like rugby. Are you guys familiar with rugby?
Yes.
Right? It's kind of like football, but not exactly. I don't see helmets on most of these guys. They don't have the big pads and everything like that. But this was one of the most famous teams in the South African rugby team. This was their former president, Nelson Mandela. They're a pretty good team to follow if you follow rugby across the country. One of the things, across the nation, one of their mascots is this animal right here, which is called a springbok. And a springbok is not very big. It's actually pretty small. But the thing about the springbok is that it actually is known for jumping. And so they can quickly get away from predators and things like that if they're fast enough and they're jumping high enough. This is actually a springbok skin. We got this in South Africa when we were traveling there one time. So this is kind of its back up to its neck, and then kind of its legs you can see there. So if you were to fold it over, that's kind of the size of it. They're not very big, are they? But the national mascot for the South African rugby team is actually the Springboks. They use the Springbok a lot as far as their mascot for a lot of their different teams. So with that said, a couple of final things before we wrap up. Well, here's cricket. You guys have seen cricket, right?
Yeah.
similar to baseball. I don't know a lot about cricket, but they play cricket in East Africa and in South Africa. Where I grew up in West Africa, it was primarily soccer all the time. So kids would play it nonstop. The last thing I wanted to talk a little bit about was culture. Change that, climate. Climate is a little bit different in different parts of Africa, and you may have studied some of this. You've got the Sahara Desert, you've got the desert areas, and you have the savannas, all the way down to the jungles, the rainforests, and kind of all those different climates that you guys have studied about, okay? And so I wanted to include a couple of pictures. The places where I lived primarily looked like these two pictures right here. So when we lived on the edge of the Sahara Desert, we were about 30 minutes from the sand dunes. Our front yard, again, kind of looked like this. We actually had a hut, very similar to that hut in our front yard. Like I said, our family was missionaries, so we built churches. The first church that we built was actually a hut where people would gather on Sunday mornings. We would ride camels ever so often. We didn't own a camel, but we had some friends that did, and we would ride them on occasion. The first time I rode a camel, I actually ran myself into the tree. The camel was fine, but I hit a couple of branches. And then over here, this is more like what I lived in when I lived a little further south in Ouagadougou. So the Ouagadougou itself had several million people. It was a big capital city, a metropolitan area, kind of like Kansas City area, probably not nearly as big. But then when you got out of the outskirts of Ouagadougou, you had some trees and you had some vegetation, you had some wildlife. In Africa, the majority of wildlife are known for being around here in East Africa, like the safaris and the elephants and everything like that. Where I lived in West Africa, there wasn't nearly as much vegetation, so we didn't have nearly as many animals. But as a kid growing up, I had 3 pet monkeys. I had a red monkey whose name was Mamzwa. Everybody say Mamzwa.
Mamzwa.
Mamzwa is actually a word in a language that I grew up learning called Moore. And Mamzwa means my friend. So I had a red monkey who was my friend. His name was Mamzwa. I had a green monkey who was a little bit smaller. It was actually a vervet is the name of the type of monkey. But her name was Daisy. Everybody say Daisy.
Daisy.
That's just an American name. Daisy was from Dukes of Hazzard, for you older people. Daisy Duke. We named her Daisy Duke because of Daisy Duke. And then we had another monkey who was the craziest monkey of all, and that was our baboon. And so our baboon's name was Sammy. And so when I was growing up as a kid, the way that we kept these animals, we didn't have them in our house. Mom wouldn't let them in the house, but instead we had them on a tree because that's where monkeys live, right?
Yeah.
So they wore a belt that was kind of like this, and it had a little loop on the side, and we had a leash. It was actually a chain that was tied to the bottom of the tree. And sure enough, the monkey could walk around all the tree, walk around the yard. We had a little water dish that it would have, and we fed it bananas and peanuts and all sorts of things. But our smartest monkey was actually our baboon. And the baboon figured out how to undo the leash from its loop. And so sure enough, the baboon would escape all the time. And we had some neighbors that lived in some of those mud houses, and remember, they had open kitchens. And so oftentimes when we were looking for Daisy the baboon, we would be walking around looking for Daisy the baboon, and sure enough, or Sammy the baboon, she would be in the neighbor's kitchen eating rice out of their cooking pots. And so we would have to apologize to our neighbor. We'd have to go buy them another bag of rice. But that was pretty fun growing up. We had 3 monkeys, we had a deer, we had a fox, we had all sorts of chickens, a couple dogs. It was kind of like having your own zoo. But we could do that because we lived in an area that had some animals, not like East Africa, but we did have some animals. When we would go and we would travel around our part of West Africa, I had some friends that worked on a game reserve, which is like a big national park, and they protected the animals. They were from Canada, but they had a boy who was my age, and I would go and spend the summers with him sometimes. And we would go on hikes. And so one of the times that we went on a hike, we were actually looking for this guy in the middle. We were looking for elephants. And we couldn't find elephants, but we saw a lot of elephant droppings. And so he had grown up in this national park. His dad was a ranger. He said, okay, I'll teach you how to track elephants. And so we started walking down this trail, and we saw a pile of elephant poop. And without even thinking about it, guess what he did? He took his finger and he stuck it in that elephant poop. I got a lot of poop stories. So he sticks it in the elephant poop, And then he says, nope, they're not close. He wipes it off on his pants, and we keep walking down this trail. The further and further we get walking down this trail, we see another pile of elephant poop, maybe over here. He does the same thing, sticks his hand in that elephant poop, pulls it out and says, oh, we're getting closer. Why do you think he said that? Because it was warmer, actually. So the first one that he saw wasn't very warm, and it was kind of crusty and nasty. But then it started getting more moist and warmer. And then we kept walking and walking, and then we got closer, and we saw another pile, and he says, hey, why don't you find out? And so I take my thumb, I stick it in there, and I pull it out, and it's pretty warm. And by that time, we know we're getting pretty close to where the elephants are. So we're starting to walk, and we come over this ridge, and sure enough, it kind of lowers down into this valley, and we were able to stand and watch big elephants like these just kind of out in the valley, grazing and eating with their young. A couple other things in terms of the climate and animal life. This tree in the middle, does anybody know what this tree in the middle is? Anybody know the name of it? You think you know that, kid?
I've seen it before.
You've seen it before? Okay. This is a tough one. You know what redwoods are here in the United States, or like the sequoias, the big trees like that? This is kind of like the sequoia of Africa. And so I bet everyone has seen this. You ever seen the movie The Lion King?
Yeah.
All right. There's a scene in The Lion King where Rafiki, the monkey, he lived in a baobab tree. This is called a baobab tree. Everybody say baobab.
Baobab.
Okay. And a lot of times, the center of the baobab, see how big this is? A lot of times they're actually hollow. And so in the movie Lion King, Rafiki's living inside the baobab tree. These baobab trees, they don't look very pretty. They don't have a lot of leaves on them or anything like that. But they have a fruit that's called monkey bread. That's what we call it. Or it's just a baobab fruit. But in that movie from Lion King, Rafiki opens up a piece of fruit, remember? And there's a picture of Simba on the inside of his tree or on the inside of his home. He dips his fingers into that fruit, and then he draws the mane around Simba, right? Symbolizing that Simba's growing up, and Simba's going to lead the lion herd, lead all the animals, and everything like that. That's from The Lion King. There's another story, though, behind the baobab. There's a myth that from years and years ago, when the earth was being formed and the earth was being created, the myth goes like this, that the people of the earth were not serving or following God, and that God was upset at them. And so then what God decided to do was take the most beautiful thing on the face of the earth, which was the baobab tree. It had the most beautiful limbs, it had the most beautiful leaves, it had the best fruit that you could possibly imagine. But he was so upset at the people on the face of the earth that he takes the tree, picks it up out of the ground, and turns it upside down and sticks the beautiful part back down into the ground. So where all was left were these really ugly branches and these really ugly limbs that don't produce any leaves and hardly produce any fruit. You guys believe that story?
Yes.
I don't either. That's why it's a myth, right? But because that story has been passed down from generation to generation to generation, from grandparents to parents to their kids for years and years and years, these stories have been told. There are a lot of Africans that are actually fearful or afraid of this tree because they think it's kind of a mystical thing, or they think there's ghosts that live there with that tree. I don't believe that, because whenever we would come around the baobab, we'd try to get inside of it if we could find a way to get into it, or we'd climb around it. But the baobab tree is massive. There are some baobab trees that would, like the base of them, if we were all to hold hands, we would barely get around the base of that tree. But maybe the base of the tree is like the size of half of this room. That's how big these trees are. They are massive. They're not nearly as tall as like the sequoias or the redwoods, but they're pretty massive trees. A couple of other landmarks that you'll recognize probably. Mount Kenya, Mount Kilimanjaro, in parts of East Africa. We didn't have mountains like this. We had more like hills. We had sand dunes in our part of the area where we lived in West Africa. And then this is Lake Victoria and Victoria Falls. You may have studied about that when you guys were looking at Southern Africa. The Nile River that runs all the way down actually contributes to Lake Victoria and Victoria Falls. Okay? So going back to animals, and then we'll wrap up with this. A lot of times people think that safaris are all over Africa, but that's not necessarily the case. if you go on a safari and you've had a good safari, you will have seen these big 5 animals, and they're the ones that are up here at the top. A lion, a Cape water buffalo, an elephant, a rhinoceros, and then a leopard or a cheetah. Those are the big 5. I've been on a couple of safaris I've never seen in that same trip all of the big 5. I've seen different ones at different times. But like I was sharing earlier, we used to track elephants. Another quick story, when I was a kid growing up with my parents, we would drive around looking for elephants out in the countryside and on safaris. And we came upon this herd one time that was kind of out tucked in behind some trees. And I got out of the car, my parents were still in the vehicle, my dad was driving. And I started trying to walk up to where these elephants were and trying to see if I could get as close to them as I possibly could. The problem was, as I was doing that, the elephant was watching me. And I was like your age, but I knew growing up that if I was going to try to do this, I needed to keep something between me and that elephant. So if the elephant was over there in the corner by the lamp, I wanted to have something between me, not a marker, something probably a little bigger, like a tree, or maybe a big boulder or a big rock, right? So that if the elephant started to get at me, they would have to go through a tree or have to go around a rock, which would slow them down, and I could try to get away. So I was inching closer and closer and closer to these elephants that were behind the trees, and I had some trees between me. There was a rock between me as well. But I noticed the big bull elephant. The bull elephant's the male elephant. See these massive ears? What do you think is going on when the bull elephant starts kind of flapping his ears like that? What do you think that means? Anybody have an idea? He's getting angry, and it's a warning, right? And so all of a sudden I start watching this bull elephant and his ears start kind of flapping back and forth. You can just picture this, right? Picture a massive elephant like that. Here I am, a kid about your age and size, trying to get as close to these guys as I can. Well, then the next thing you know, I got a little too close, and he decides he's going to run around those couple of trees that were in between he and I and that rock. So he starts coming around it, and he starts getting closer and closer, and I took off running. I jumped on the top of my dad's car on the roof rack, and we drove away. There was another time where I was in a Jeep, and we were tracking elephants, and we were watching this herd of elephants, and we came up close to them, and they were pretty close to our car, and we turned off the car. We had a guide with us, a ranger that was with us, and we sat there and we watched them for a while. I was a little bit older this time, and I had a camera, and it was a cloudy day, kind of like today, and I was taking all these great pictures, and then all of a sudden, guess what happened? Because it was cloudy, my flash went off. And Mr. Bull Elephant did not like my flash. And so he started running at our vehicle. We were parked, the car was turned off, it was a Jeep, so it didn't have a roof, it was open air. All of a sudden, this big bull elephant starts running at me. I'm still taking pictures from the back of this Jeep. The ranger starts up his car and starts to drive away just as that bull elephant reaches out his trunk to try to grab the camera. Fortunately, we started moving and he never got my camera, but I got some really good pictures. So that's a little bit about life in Africa. You guys have any questions that maybe you guys have talked about in class or questions from our presentation here this morning? One question?
Did he just run straight at you, or did he do a parallel walk?
I kind of had to run around the tree and the rock. But yeah, once they got around that stuff, then they'll just run straight at you.
Normally the elephants do a parallel walk where they like
Kind
circle
of
you,
at an
and they're
angle.
deciding if they're going to attack. Normally they do attack when
You've
they
seen that
do
before?
parallel walk. I watch National Geographic.
That's a good resource. You
Right.
bet. Yes, ma'am.
Like, did you move back to the United States?
Great question. So I told you I left when I was a year old, right? And we lived in France, and then we lived down in Africa. What we would do is we would go over for 4 years. So we lived there for 4 years straight. And then we would come back for a year to the United States and visit family and get supplies and things like that. And then we would go back for 4 years, come back for a year. And so we did that all the way until I was about 14. So I came back to the United States for high school. And then whenever I was in college, I was engaged, and my to-be wife and I actually traveled back to West Africa. We visited Ivory Coast and Burkina Faso, where I grew up. I'd like to go back sometime and take my kids. That's probably going to be our next trip, so they can see where Dad grew up. So. Yes, sir.
Didn't you say you had chickens?
We did.
My cousin has chickens. They
Yeah.
have like a mini farm.
Yep, there you go. Yes, ma'am.
What was education like when you went to school? What did that look like for you?
That is a good question as well. When I was growing up for school, I was homeschooled. Anybody been homeschooled in here? Maybe a couple of you? Okay. So think about it. Remember we're talking about living in the desert? When I lived in the desert, my mom was my teacher. And so I would start my morning at about 7:30 and we would do our classwork. It was a lot different than Epic Elementary, believe me. And then at about noontime, I was done. So I had the rest of the afternoon off to play with my friends. When we lived in the desert, we didn't have electricity. And so I would oftentimes either do my schoolwork outside, or I had a kerosene lamp that had oil in it and that we would light, and we would put it, it's kind of like just a lantern, that I would do my coursework inside the house or do my studies inside the house. When I lived in Burkina Faso in Ouagadougou, the capital city of Ouagadougou, we actually went to an international school. And it was kindergarten through grade 8. There were 60 different countries that were represented in that international school. We only had 90 kids. And so I knew everybody, but I went there for 4th grade, 6th grade, 7th grade, and 8th grade, because that's where we lived, was in that capital city. Okay? Another question?
My mom went to Paul.
Very cool. World travel. Yes?
Did you have any friends growing up?
I did. I had a lot of African friends. But then, like I said, being in that international school, I ended up having a lot of friends from a lot of different countries around the world. So a couple of my best friends, one of my best friends was from Vietnam, and then another one of my best friends was from Ethiopia. I had several from Nigeria, as well as friends from Ghana. And so another example, when I was in school, something that I just thought of, you know how here, like in high schools will play each other in basketball or volleyball or football. We didn't do that when I grew up, but instead, we had international schools, those small schools that had lots of different people in them, and we would compete against each other. So like the International School of Ouagadougou would travel to the International School of Bamako in Mali, or we'd travel to the International School of Niamey, Niger, or we'd travel to the International School of Lomé, Togo. So we got to travel to a lot of different countries, playing sports and just doing different exchanges with students that were similar to us from other parts of the world. You have a question? Very cool. So he's been to a couple of different countries in Africa. Very cool. Back there.
Why did you move to Africa? Why did your parents decide to?
They were missionaries, and so they went over there to build churches. And so then they also started working with wells and building or helping build wells in parts of Africa. But then they also started what's called Africa's Children, which was to help children that were orphaned. Tried to give them group homes and a place to live, things like that, give them food and clothing. They also helped start some schools. And then my brother was in Africa as well. He was a little bit older than me, but he helped individuals or families that had AIDS, as far as AIDS awareness and AIDS prevention and treatment. So, yeah, those are some of the things, some of the jobs that we did when we lived in West Africa and other parts of Africa. Anybody over here, what's your question?
What was your favorite part?
We had a lot of freedom in Africa. So like I could leave my house and I could go wherever I wanted to and be gone all day. Here in the United States, we don't have that. Our parents stay pretty close to us and they watch what we're doing, which is what they need to do, right? But in Africa, we could go on all sorts of adventures. When I lived in the Sahara Desert, I took that picture down. But when I lived in the Sahara Desert, at the very top of Burkina Faso, we lived in a small village called Goram Goram. And albeit it was all sand and there were sand dunes around, about 3 miles from my house there was this big mountain that was actually made out of quartz. And as a kid it seemed huge, but it wasn't, it wasn't like Mount Kilimanjaro or anything like that. We could climb to the top of it pretty quickly. But we would go and we would hang out on the top of this quartz mountain. And quartz is kind of like a white rock, if you've ever seen that quartz rock. And so it sticks out in the middle of the Sahara Desert, in the middle of the sand and close to the sand dunes, and here's this big white outcropping. So when the sun was setting or when the sun was shining on it, it was pretty amazing, but we would just go up there and climb around and hang out and play different games. So, a couple other questions. Yes, sir?
Did you ever try like butterfly larvae and like if you did you like it?
Butterfly larvae, no, but I have eaten a few weird things in my life. 2 things that come to mind when I was a kid. termites. So you know what termites are, that eat wood and they kind of live in wood or they live under the ground. We had these termites that were probably about as long as the end of my finger. They weren't that fat, but they were about the length of my finger. And during the rainy seasons, they had wings and they would actually fly. And so the rain would hit and the water would go down into the ground. They lived under the ground and they would start flying out. And what we would do is we would take like a little sack or a little bag, kind of like a Walmart bag, and hold it over their entrance as they were flying out. And we would catch a bunch of these termites, and then we'd go and we'd put them over like a little pan, like in a campfire, and we'd roast them up. And then we'd grab them and then we'd blow on them and kind of shake them to get their wings off, and then we'd pop them in our mouth. They kind of tasted like peanuts or peanut butter. Even more gross than that, when I was a kid I had a BB gun, and at nighttime I would take my BB gun and a flashlight, and I would go in our backyard when we lived in Ouagadougou, and we had these huge mango trees, and mangoes are probably my favorite fruit. But we had these huge mango trees, and these mangoes were about this big. And at nighttime, bats would come up and they would eat off the mangoes, and they were called fruit bats. And these fruit bats could get pretty big. They could get as big as, about half the size of a football. And then if you were to stretch their wings out, maybe their wings were about this big. So these were pretty ugly looking bats. But at nighttime, we would go and we would shoot bats, and they would fall out of the tree, and then we would cook them and eat them. And yes, they tasted like chicken. That's a good question. Right over here. That's a good question. She asked the question, listen real closely, she asked if we had a president, and we did have a president. But the interesting thing in Africa, you know how here in November we're getting ready to have a big election to elect the next president of the United States? They've not always done that in Africa. And instead, maybe they've had kings, or maybe they've had presidents that would stay longer than their 4-year term, that they're supposed to stay here in the United States. And sometimes they had corrupt kings and corrupt presidents. So when we were living in Africa, one night I went to bed in Upper Volta. Remember how the name changed? One night I went to bed in Upper Volta. That night they killed the president. And they put a new president in power who was one of their military leaders. The next morning I was in the same bed, I was in the exact same room, in the same house. I hadn't left, but I woke up in a completely different country because they had changed the name from Upper Volta to Burkina Faso. And so that night they actually changed the flag. The flag had been red, white, and black, like 3 stripes, red, white, and black. And then they changed the flag to red and green, like there's a red stripe and green with a yellow star in the middle. They changed the motto, they changed the national anthem, they changed all those things overnight to become the country of Burkina Faso. That president stuck around for a long time. But while he was becoming president, because he had killed the past president, there was a lot of unrest in our country. And so we had a curfew. You know what a curfew is? A curfew was when you had to be in your house. So like you could be out during the day, people that had jobs or to go to school, but you had to be back in your house and you could not leave your house until, let's say after 6 o'clock in the evening. So you couldn't go to church later that evening, you couldn't go to a movie, you couldn't do any of those things because they were trying to control the country. We also had in our capital city when we lived in Ouagadougou, across the street from our house, they had all these military cars and vehicles and tanks. They had a tank that was pointed at our house for about 6 months. Because again, it was a new president, they were trying to control the country and bring order to the country. But over time, things kind of got more peaceful. But while I was in Upper Volta or Burkina Faso, things like this happened 4 different times. And it's called a coup d'etat, which is an overthrow of the government. Okay? Let's go with 2 more questions. We have time? Okay.
2 more.
One here.
Were there any pestering bugs and stuff, like mosquitoes?
Yeah, so lots of mosquitoes. And mosquitoes can carry different types of diseases. One disease that you may have heard about was actually malaria. And malaria has a lot of different causes and a lot of different connections, but one of the things is poor water quality. And so malaria can actually be carried by mosquitoes and different things like that. So mosquitoes, we had scorpions. We had small scorpions like this that were pretty powerful. If you got stung by a small scorpion, it could really hurt. But then we had larger scorpions that were closer to about this size when you spread their tail all the way out. We had snakes. But then we also had geckos. Anybody know what a gecko is? You know the Geico commercial? Yeah, totally. They have them in parts in Florida. Yeah.
We went to our hotel, we look up in the lights and there's like a chopstick.
And they kind of scurry around the walls and everything like that. But you know what the great thing about geckos and lizards are? They actually eat mosquitoes. So we were fine having geckos in our house. But when I took my wife, my fiance at the time, when I took my wife for the first time to Africa before we got married, she had never seen a gecko before, and it freaked her. So there was about 6 or 7 of us that were staying in this house, and the guys were in one room and the girls were in another room, and she couldn't sleep. And so she called in the middle of the night and said, "Hey, I need help." And so she was trying to move her bed underneath the ceiling fan in the middle of the room, because she was thinking, with all of her wisdom, that if a gecko fell from the ceiling, it would hit the fan would chop it up, and it would not get on her. But then I told her, I said, "Well, if that happened, wouldn't you get all the gecko's guts on you?" But she didn't sleep very well when she was in Africa because of those crazy geckos. Good question. Last question. Who's not had a chance here? Right there.
How did you get like your
Good question. So there were other families that had animals like the monkeys. So like one monkey we got from another family that was leaving to come back to the United States. And so we told them that we would take care of it. Other times you can actually go to the market and you can actually buy animals, whether it's monkeys or deer or other things like that. A lot of times people will use them for food, but we were just going to use them for pets. So yeah, that's a great question. Hey, it's been great hanging out with you guys here this morning. I'm pretty excited each year whenever they ask me to come over and talk, and I'm incredibly excited you guys are learning about different parts of Africa. But as you've talked about in some of your guiding questions, water is a huge issue. And so be thinking about, what can we do as people that live here in the United States, whether it's to conserve water, or maybe projects to become part of as far as helping out other places like in Africa or other parts of the world that need water. The last thing I want you to do, and I don't know if you guys have done this, so tell me if you have, I want you to go home tonight and I want you to count. Have you done this?
No.
I want you to count how many water sources you have in your house. Okay?
Pictures on your iPad of each
Oh,
source.
do you want to do that? Okay.
If you want to throw that in there.
If you have your iPad at home tonight, take pictures of them, and I want you to count how many sources of water you have in your house. And let me give you some examples. Okay? So if I were going home to do this assignment, I'd get out my iPhone or my iPad, and I would go, probably first I'd go to my kitchen sink, and I'd take a picture of that because I have hot and cold water there at that kitchen sink. And then I'd look around my kitchen. Maybe I have a refrigerator where I can take my cup and I can just stick my cup up there and fill it up with water. Maybe I would take a picture of that, okay? And then some other examples in your bathroom. Everybody's got a sink. Maybe you have a bathroom that has 2 sinks. There's 4 sources of water, right? 2 hot and cold on each sink. So a hot and cold on each sink. The other thing that sometimes we don't think about is our washers. You go into your laundry room, you go to your washing machine, it can't run without water, and guess what? It has cold water running, and it has hot water running. So I bet you can find a lot of examples of sources of water. Count them all up, and then compare it to what you're learning about in different places in Africa. That family that lived in the tent, did they have as many sources of water? Probably not. But I think that's probably going to be eye-opening for us as we take a look at how valuable water is, okay? Thank you guys so much.